He just wanted to finish the renovation and leave. But under the old church, he found a hatch that reminded him of the past he was running from. Look what he found underground. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The road to Rivermont curved along the edge of the coast like a gray ribbon drawn by a tired hand. The ocean stretched endlessly beside it, restless and cold, throwing white spray against the rocks. Nolan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his thigh, the hum of the old pickup blending with the sound of the sea. He had been driving for hours, and the silence had settled in the cab like fog, thick, heavy, and strangely comforting. The last sign of civilization had disappeared miles ago, replaced by cliffs, gulls, and the faint salt haze that blurred the horizon. He hadn't planned to come here. The decision had been made in a motel room somewhere in Idaho, where he had sat staring at the wall until morning and decided that anywhere would be better than where he was. Rivermont had been a dot on the map, a name attached to a coastline. It promised isolation, the kind that didn't ask questions. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, the clouds had lowered, dimming the daylight into a dull gray. The streets were narrow and empty, the houses small and weathered, painted in colors that once might have been cheerful. The air smelled of salt, old wood, and something faintly metallic, like wet iron. He parked in front of a diner and sat for a moment, watching the sign flicker. Fisherman's Rest. Inside, a few locals were scattered along the counter, speaking in quiet tones. He didn't join them. He only ordered coffee to go, handed over a crumpled bill, and left without a word. People here noticed him, but not in the way of cities. Their looks were brief, assessing, then indifferent. That suited him fine. The room he rented was above a small carpenter's workshop, the kind of place that still smelled of sawdust and varnish. It had one window facing the sea, a narrow bed, a desk, and a chair that creaked when he leaned back. The landlord had left a note with the keys. "Rent due on the first Monday. Water runs slow. Don't mind the wind. It never stops." That first night, Nolan stood at the window long after darkness fell. Out beyond the cliffs, the waves crashed rhythmically, each one sounding like a memory trying to surface. He didn't let them. He hadn't for years. He had been an engineer once, a good one. His work for the Department of Defense had been quiet, technical, buried deep within layers of clearance. He had designed underground structures, coastal surveillance bunkers, communication tunnels. He used to joke that he was more comfortable beneath the ground than above it. But the joke had ended the night of the accident. A ventilation system had failed during a field test in Nevada. 3 men hadn't made it out in time. His report said it had been a systems error. His conscience told him otherwise. Afterward came the sleepless nights, the tremors, the withdrawal from colleagues who stopped calling after the first few months. Eventually, he signed the papers for medical leave and never went back. In Rivermont, he found work that required hands, not memories. The town council had posted a notice about a small contract: repair an old church on the northern edge of town. The pay was low, but that didn't matter. The building was old stone and timber, standing on a bluff where the land curved sharply down to the water. It hadn't been used in decades, and the last storm had torn off part of the roof. Nolan accepted the job without hesitation. Solitude was part of the bargain. When he first saw the church, he thought it looked less like a place of worship and more like a sentinel keeping watch over the ocean. The walls were streaked with salt, the windows fogged with age. Moss crept along the northern side, where the wind hit hardest. The ground sloped steeply toward a line of boulders below, half buried in sand. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of oil from old lamps. The pews had been removed long ago, leaving the stone floor bare except for scattered debris. He set up his tools near the altar, unpacked his lunch, and got to work. The first week passed without interruption. Each morning he climbed the hill with his toolbox, repaired beams, scraped away rot, measured walls. Each evening he walked back down to the town, ate at the diner, and returned to his room to read until sleep took him. It was the kind of rhythm he understood, predictable, silent, safe. The townspeople began to recognize him but didn't intrude. Now and then, an old fisherman would nod as he passed, or a woman at the store would mention the weather, but no one asked who he was or why he had come. That anonymity was its own kind of mercy. On the second Friday, an elderly man appeared at the church just after noon. He was tall, stooped, wearing a coat several sizes too large, and a cap that looked older than he was. He introduced himself as Father Peter, the former priest of the parish. His voice was soft, careful, as if he didn't want to disturb the air inside. They spoke briefly. Peter told him that the church had been built by returning naval engineers after the Second World War. They had leftover materials from the coastal fortifications, the priest said, looking toward the sea. Concrete, steel, things that didn't belong in a church but found a home here anyway. Nolan nodded but didn't answer. The old man smiled faintly, said he was glad someone was finally taking care of the place, and left. After that, the work took on a different weight. Nolan began noticing the odd mixture of materials, reinforced joints where there should have been simple timber, bolts embedded in the stone with precision far beyond what local builders would have used. He told himself it was just a matter of design, that maybe the builders had used what they had. But part of him, the engineer still buried under layers of denial, felt a flicker of recognition. One afternoon, while clearing the area behind the northern wall, he found something that didn't belong. The ground there was rougher, littered with driftwood and stones washed down by years of rain. As he moved the rocks aside, a flash of dull metal caught the light. He crouched, brushed away the sand, and uncovered a flat, square edge. It took nearly an hour to expose the whole thing. A heavy steel hatch, half buried, its hinges crusted with rust. The handle was cold to the touch, the kind designed to seal airtight compartments. He sat back, breathing hard, staring at it. For a long moment, the sound of the ocean faded, replaced by the faint hum of remembered machinery. He knew that design, the shape, the placement of the bolts, even the faint groove where a locking mechanism once sat. It was identical to the hatches used in coastal defense bunkers. He had drawn something like it himself years ago for a project he thought had been decommissioned. The discovery sent a tremor through him, not of fear, but of recognition, as though a fragment of his own life had surfaced from the earth. He closed the hatch carefully, pressing the sand back over it until it disappeared beneath the stones. He told himself it was nothing. An old access point, maybe, or a storm drain built decades ago. Still, when he packed up for the evening, his hands shook as he folded his tools. That night, the wind rose sharply, rattling the window of his room. He lay awake listening to it, watching the pale moonlight drift across the ceiling. Every sound from outside seemed to echo in his mind: the scrape of branches, the soft whistle through the cracks in the frame, the far-off crash of the surf. He thought about the hatch, the pattern of the bolts, the precision of the metalwork. It shouldn't have been there. Churches were built for shelter, not secrecy. And yet he couldn't shake the sense that he had seen it before, not just in blueprints, but in memory. He turned on the lamp and sat up, his breath unsteady. His reflection in the window looked older than he remembered, lined, tired, distant. He hadn't wanted to think about the past for years, but the hatch had opened something he couldn't close again. He remembered the day of the accident, the alarms, the locked door, the sound of fists pounding from the other side before everything went silent. He had never returned to that site. The government closed it within a week, and the reports buried it deeper than the earth itself. He had tried to do the same with his conscience, to cover it over with new beginnings. But guilt had a way of waiting, patient as rust. When morning came, the air smelled of rain. He drove back to the church and stood for a long time on the bluff, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. The hatch was still there beneath the sand, quiet, unassuming, as if nothing had happened. He knew he should report it, or at least tell someone, but there was no reason to. It wasn't his business anymore. He had come here to build, not to dig. And yet, as he stepped into the cool, dim light of the church and picked up his hammer, he couldn't stop glancing toward the northern wall, where the stones hid something he couldn't unsee. Days passed. He worked without rest, fixing beams, sanding walls, patching the roof. But each evening he found himself drawn to the back of the property, standing where the ground sloped down to the stones. Sometimes he would trace the outline of the hatch with his boot, feeling the hidden edge beneath the earth. The more he tried to ignore it, the louder it seemed to call to him, not in sound, but in memory. It was as if the metal itself held echoes of every sealed door he had ever designed. Doors meant to protect, but also to trap. By the end of the second week, he stopped pretending. The past wasn't behind him. It was under his feet, waiting. One morning, he came to the church before dawn, carrying a lantern and a crowbar. The air was still, the sea calm. He stood for a moment, watching the light grow along the horizon, then turned toward the northern wall. The sand was damp and cool. He knelt, brushed away the stones, and uncovered the hatch once more. The handle was stiff, reluctant, as if it didn't want to be moved. When it finally turned, a hollow clang echoed beneath the ground, followed by a deep silence. He hesitated, his hand trembling on the edge of the opening. Below him was darkness, cold and absolute. The smell of salt and rust drifted up like a whisper from another time. He lowered the lantern and saw the faint glint of metal steps leading down into the earth. His throat tightened. He didn't know what waited there, abandoned machinery, perhaps, or just empty corridors eaten by time. But something inside him already knew that it wouldn't be empty. He stood there for a long moment, the wind tugging at his jacket, the ocean murmuring below. Then he closed the hatch, sealing the darkness again, and pressed the sand back into place. He would wait. Just a day or two, he told himself. He would think about it first. But deep down, he knew there would be no peace until he went back down. The silence around him felt heavier now, not the calm of solitude, but the weight of something buried, something that, sooner or later, would have to be faced. And as the waves broke against the rocks below, Nolan turned toward the sea, knowing that the stillness he had sought for so long was over. The quiet of Rivermont had given him rest, but not redemption. What waited beneath that hatch was more than metal and concrete. It was the part of himself he had buried years ago, and it was calling him back. The following morning broke cold and still. A low fog drifted in from the ocean, curling around the cliffs like smoke. Nolan arrived at the church before the sun had cleared the horizon. The silence of the place felt heavier than usual, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. He parked the truck, sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, and stared at the outline of the building through the mist. The previous night had left him restless, his sleep fractured by images he hadn't seen in years. Corridors dimly lit by red emergency lamps, the echo of sirens, the sound of metal bending under pressure. He woke each time with his pulse hammering, the name of the dead still unspoken on his lips. Now, as he stepped into the cold morning air, that same pulse thrummed beneath his ribs. The hatch waited for him behind the northern wall, a scar of iron half swallowed by the soil. He told himself he had come only to verify what it was, to satisfy the stubborn curiosity of an engineer who couldn't leave a mystery unsolved. But he knew that wasn't the truth. Something deeper had drawn him here, something that had less to do with curiosity than with need. For the first time in years, he felt the pull of purpose, however dangerous. The ground was damp from the fog. When he brushed away the top layer of sand, the metal was slick beneath his fingers. He set down the lantern beside him, slid the crowbar under the edge, and pushed. The hinges groaned, resisting him like a creature that didn't want to wake. A burst of stale air rushed out from below, carrying with it the scent of salt and iron and long decay. He hesitated, his breath shallow, then leaned forward and looked down. The light from his lantern trembled against the walls of a narrow shaft. Steel steps descended into darkness, each one corroded, but still intact. He gripped the railing and felt the cold bite of metal against his palm. It was built with precision, reinforced, and he knew the type of design it was standard in coastal observation structures from the mid-20th century. He had drawn them himself. Slowly, he began to climb down, his boots ringing softly against the ladder. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, until his breath hung visible before him. When his feet touched the floor, the sound of the sea was gone. Only the faint hum of the lantern filled the space. The chamber was small, perhaps 3 meters wide, 4 long, and built entirely of concrete. The walls were streaked with moisture, the ceiling cracked in places where roots had pushed through. To his right lay the remains of what had once been a console: switches, wires, corroded dials. To his left, a passageway extended into shadow, half collapsed. He swept the lantern slowly across the wall until the light caught on something that made his throat tighten. A rusted metal plate, bolted near the entrance, bore the remnants of a serial number: Coastal Monitoring Station Number 7. He stepped closer, running his fingers across the faded stenciling. The recognition was instant, almost painful. He had seen this designation in old project archives during his first years of service. The Coastal Defense Program had established a series of observation points along the Pacific, designed to detect incoming naval or aerial activity. He had assumed they had all been dismantled decades ago. But here, one of them lay buried beneath a church, sealed away and forgotten. For a long time he stood motionless, his pulse echoing in his ears. The air was heavy with the smell of rust and sea rot. He turned toward the console, brushing away layers of dust and debris. Beneath his hands, the instruments were familiar in form, even if time had devoured their function. An old ventilation pipe ran along the ceiling, and in the far corner, a thick bundle of cables disappeared into the wall. Every inch of it spoke the language of his past, the logic of control, of safety through containment, the belief that walls and locks could protect people from the world's chaos. But they hadn't protected the men he'd lost. The longer he stared at the broken machinery, the more the walls seemed to close in. He lifted the lantern toward the dark corridor that extended deeper underground. The passage was narrow and uneven, littered with fragments of concrete and bent rebar. He took a cautious step forward, his boots sinking slightly into damp soil. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly ahead. As he moved, the lantern's light revealed patches of paint still clinging to the walls. Yellow markings, faded numbers, technical notes written in the same shorthand he used years ago. It was like walking through a forgotten blueprint. The path curved to the right and ended abruptly where the ceiling had caved in, forming a mound of broken stone. Among the debris, something metallic glinted. Nolan knelt, brushing away the dirt until he uncovered a small steel box, its surface warped with age. He pried it open. Inside were scraps of paper, nearly disintegrated, and a photograph sealed in plastic. The photograph showed a group of men standing on a rocky shore beside a freshly constructed bunker. They wore work uniforms, their faces shaded by caps. At the far edge of the group stood a younger man with narrow shoulders and a cautious smile himself, barely 20. The sight struck him like a blow. He had forgotten this image, forgotten that day entirely. He remembered now the cold wind on the coast, the scent of salt and oil, the pride of accomplishment that had filled him before everything went wrong. His younger self looked confident, unbroken by the weight that would come later. The photo trembled in his hand. He closed the box, placed it carefully back where he'd found it, and stood. The air down there felt tighter now, heavier, as though the space itself disapproved of being disturbed. He could almost hear the echo of his own past footsteps on these same concrete floors, though he knew that was impossible. He turned back toward the ladder, the lantern flickering as he climbed. When he emerged into the daylight, he had to shield his eyes from the sudden brightness. The fog had lifted, revealing the vast sweep of the ocean below. He breathed deeply, but the air above ground felt thin, almost insufficient. He sat for a while near the hatch, staring at the waves, trying to still his thoughts. The discovery had changed something inside him, though he couldn't yet name what. That evening, he went to the town library, a small brick building near the square. Inside, the air was dry and smelled faintly of dust and varnish. An old woman at the front desk looked up as he entered, surprised to see a stranger at that hour. He asked about local archives, specifically anything related to Cold War installations or naval activity in the area. She led him to a back room where stacks of yellowing newspapers and municipal reports lined the shelves. For hours he sifted through them, scanning headlines and clippings. Finally, in a brittle edition from 1961, he found what he was looking for: a brief mention of experimental observation posts established along the Oregon coastline as part of a coastal monitoring initiative. Most were decommissioned within a decade, absorbed into civilian properties, or demolished. Only one was listed as unaccounted for, Station 7. Its location, according to the record, had been transferred to civilian oversight, but the coordinates were missing. He folded the paper carefully, knowing he no longer needed them. He had already stood above that lost coordinate. That night, he dreamed of the Nevada desert, the testing site where everything ended. The dream came in fragments, the flicker of warning lights, the hiss of pressure valves, the voice of his partner shouting through static. The memory was precise enough to make him wake with the taste of metal in his mouth. He sat upright, gripping the edge of the bed, trying to steady his breathing. He had buried that memory so deeply he thought it had died, but now it was alive again, brought to the surface by a hatch of rusted steel. The following days blurred together. He worked on the church during daylight, but found himself returning to the hatch each afternoon. He told himself it was research, that he was simply documenting what he'd found. He began sketching diagrams of the chamber, marking the position of the cables and the collapsed corridor. The technical part of his mind, the part that once solved problems for a living, was awake again. Yet with each visit, the sense of unease grew. The walls whispered of confinement. The echo of his footsteps sounded too much like those in the bunker before the accident. He would climb back into the light and sit on the rocks, staring at his trembling hands. One evening, Father Peter returned, walking slowly along the path that led to the church. The sky was streaked with orange and gray, the ocean below gleaming like tarnished silver. The old man smiled faintly when he saw Nolan, but his eyes carried a weight that time hadn't softened. They spoke for a while about the progress of the repairs. Then, as if in passing, Peter mentioned something that froze him. "When I first arrived here, back in the 80s, the priest said, a few men from Washington came to inspect the property. They spent days taking measurements near the foundation, then asked that a section of the basement be sealed. They told us it was for safety. No one questioned it. Nolan said nothing, but his grip tightened on the hammer he held. The priest looked out toward the sea, then back at him. "You find anything unusual under there?" he asked lightly. Nolan forced a small, practiced smile. "Just old stone and rust," he said. The old man nodded, satisfied, and left soon after. That night, Nolan returned to the hatch one final time. He carried only the lantern and a notebook. The ocean below was dark, restless, the sound of it merging with the wind. He opened the hatch and descended slowly, each step ringing in the silence. Inside, the air was colder than before. He knelt by the broken console and traced a line of dust across the surface. A faint vibration ran through the metal, perhaps from the wind outside, but it felt alive beneath his fingertips. He moved to the collapsed wall, the one that had hidden the steel box, and began clearing the debris more carefully. After several minutes, his lantern caught on something, a narrow cavity behind the rubble. He reached in and pulled free a second box, smaller than the first, sealed with rusted clasps. When he opened it, a folded sheaf of papers fell into his hands. They were blueprints, badly faded, but legible. The header bore the insignia of the Department of Defense and a signature scrawled in the corner. N. Nolan, lead engineer. He froze. The date was 20 years old. He scanned the drawings, recognizing the design instantly identical layouts to the ventilation systems used in the Nevada facility where the accident had happened. But the blueprints bore a later revision date, marked several months after he had resigned. That meant the system hadn't been scrapped. It had been relocated, perhaps here, beneath this church, disguised and forgotten. He felt the breath leave his body. The walls around him seemed to lean closer, as if listening. The truth came to him slowly, terribly. His work, the same mechanisms that had failed and killed his team, might have been reinstalled here, hidden under new foundations, reused for another purpose no one ever disclosed. He sat in the dirt for a long time, staring at the papers trembling in his hands. Guilt rose in him like a tide, unstoppable and suffocating. He thought he had left it all behind. The failures, the silence of those corridors, the weight of his own negligence. But it had followed him, buried under stone, waiting for him to find it again. The lantern sputtered, casting shadows that stretched and wavered like ghosts on the walls. He closed the box, pressed his palm to the cold concrete, and whispered a name he hadn't spoken in years. Then he stood, climbed the ladder, and pushed open the hatch. The night air struck him like water. The sky above was full of stars, sharp and cold. He sat beside the open hatch, the document still clutched in his hand. He understood now that the past could not be buried. It simply waited, patient and silent, beneath the ground. The sea roared below, relentless, eternal. And in that sound, he heard the truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He would never be free of it until he faced it completely. He folded the papers carefully, slid them into his jacket, and looked out toward the dark horizon where the ocean met the sky. Somewhere below him, the old tunnels breathed with the slow exhale of the earth. Tomorrow, he would decide what to do. But tonight, he would sit here and listen to the sea, feeling the pull of the tide, the rhythm of memory and regret merging into one. The world above was quiet again, but the silence no longer offered comfort. It was only the pause before reckoning, before the moment when a man finally chooses whether to keep burying the past or to bring it into the light. The morning after his final descent into the bunker came with a muted sky, a thin veil of silver clouds hanging low over the ocean. Nolan stood on the edge of the bluff, watching the tide crash against the rocks below. The wind smelled of rain and salt, and for a long while he simply let it touch his face. The papers he had taken from the underground chamber rested inside a waterproof folder on the passenger seat of his truck. He hadn't slept. Instead, he had sat through the night by the window, reading and rereading his own handwriting. Technical annotations, dates, initials. Every line reminded him of a man he used to be, efficient, confident, certain that logic and structure could protect people from the chaos of the world. But they hadn't. He had built systems of control, and those systems had killed. He returned to the church at first light, unlocking the door with a steady hand that didn't feel like his own. The interior smelled faintly of dust and pine, the scent of sawdust from his recent repairs lingering in the air. The place looked different now, tidier, cleaner, almost peaceful. But beneath that calm, he felt the weight of what lay under it. The knowledge pressed against his chest like a physical thing. For years he had tried to separate his life into before and after the man who served and the man who walked away. Yet now he saw that the two had never truly divided. They had been joined all along, one hidden inside the other, like the bunker beneath the church. He set down his tools, unfolded the documents on the altar table, and studied them again in the growing light. The design was unmistakable. The ventilation systems, the containment protocols, the circuits, all his. The discovery left him hollow, a man realizing that even after resignation, his work had continued without him, perhaps even because of him. Someone had reused the blueprints, repurposed the systems, and hidden them where no one would think to look. The church, with its walls of faith and its silence, had become the perfect disguise. He wondered who had made that choice, who had signed the final order that buried his designs beneath a house of God. By mid-morning, he drove into town and parked near the post office. His steps felt heavier with each block. The small government building that doubled as the local administrative office stood across from the square, its paint peeling in the sea air. Inside, a woman behind the counter looked up from her desk, startled by his presence. He introduced himself and asked for the address of the municipal records office. She pointed down the hall. In a dim room lined with filing cabinets, he found an old computer terminal still connected to state archives. It took him hours to navigate the outdated interface, but eventually he located a reference to the land transfer from federal to local authority, Rivermont Church, parcel 41B. The details were vague, but one entry caught his attention. Transferred with existing substructure, classified for non-military reuse, 1983. No mention of decommissioning, no indication of inspection, nothing that explained why the structure had been sealed instead of removed. When he left the building, the wind had picked up. The square was nearly empty, except for a few townspeople carrying groceries and a pair of children chasing a ball. Ordinary life unfolded around him, indifferent to what he carried in his hands. The realization settled over him quietly. No one here would ever know what lay beneath the ground they walked on. And maybe they didn't need to. The past, however heavy, was his burden alone. But there was still something he could do with it, something that resembled responsibility, even redemption. He spent the rest of the day writing. At the desk in his rented room, he filled pages with measured precision, describing everything he had found, the condition of the hatch, the layout of the chamber, the documents, the potential hazards. He included drawings, cross-sections, and annotations, just as he used to in his reports. But this time, the tone was different. It wasn't an engineer's detached language. It was the confession of a man reclaiming truth. When he finished, he printed the report, attached the photographs he had taken, and wrote 2 letters. One addressed to the Department of Defense's Office of Historical Review, and the other to the Rivermont Municipal Council. In the second, he suggested that the site could serve as a historical landmark, a reminder of an era when fear had driven men to bury steel beneath sanctuaries. It was not penance, exactly, but perhaps a way to prevent silence from becoming complicity again. That evening, He returned to the church to gather the last of his tools. Father Peter was waiting outside, leaning on his cane. The priest looked at him with quiet curiosity. "You've done good work here," he said softly. "It feels lighter somehow." Nolan smiled faintly. Maybe it just needed someone to care for it again. The old man nodded. "Sometimes the land remembers what we try to forget." His words lingered like mist as Nolan locked the door for the last time. The next morning, the mail truck left town carrying 2 thick envelopes, one destined for Washington, the other to the local office just down the hill. When he watched it disappear along the coastal road, Nolan felt something inside him unclench. The act was small, almost invisible, but it was an act of truth, and that mattered. 3 days later, the first response came. A plain white envelope from the department bore a brief message of acknowledgement and gratitude, informing him that an investigative team would visit the site to assess safety conditions and potential historical value. There was no apology, no explanation, no mention of what the government had hidden. But that didn't matter. For the first time in years, the silence in his life was no longer avoidance, it was acceptance. When the officials arrived, their presence rippled quietly through the town. They came in 2 unmarked trucks, wearing windbreakers and carrying equipment Nolan recognized from his years in service. They spoke little, worked methodically, and when they were done, they sealed the hatch with a new lock and placed a warning sign beside it. The church grounds were declared restricted for the time being. Curious locals watched from the road, whispering about secret tunnels and buried treasure. But the interest faded within a week. Life in Rivermont returned to its ordinary rhythm, the sea erasing its traces as it always did. Nolan did not interfere. He stood at a distance each day, watching as they restored what he had disturbed. There was a strange comfort in seeing it handled properly, in knowing that the truth was no longer hidden. The weight he had carried for decades seemed to shift, not vanish, but settle somewhere he could live with. The nightmares began to fade. When they came, they no longer ended in suffocating silence, but in the sound of wind rushing through open doors. Once the officials left, the town moved on. But the church remained, repaired, painted, standing proud against the sea. The community planned to reopen it as a heritage site, though few truly understood what heritage meant in this context. Nolan was asked to finish the final touches, the painting of the walls, the installation of new benches. He agreed. The work was slow but steady, and with each nail, each brushstroke, he felt the distance between who he had been and who he was, now widen just enough to breathe. On his last day, the sky cleared. The sun broke through for the first time in weeks, turning the ocean a deep, impossible blue. Nolan stood at the doorway of the completed church and looked around. The walls gleamed softly in the light. The new cross atop the roof caught the sun like a blade of glass. Everything looked calm, unburdened. He walked around the side, down toward the slope where the sealed hatch lay beneath a fresh layer of soil. A new metal plaque stood nearby, simple and understated. Site of Coastal Defense Observation Post, 1959 to 1983. Preserved in recognition of those who built and those who were lost. He crouched beside it and ran his hand across the inscription. The wind rose off the sea, lifting his hair, carrying with it the scent of salt and pine. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel the urge to move, to run, to bury himself elsewhere. The noise inside him had quieted. The sea roared, the gulls cried, and life continued, indifferent but whole. That evening, he locked up the church for the final time. His tools were packed neatly in the truck bed, the back seat empty except for his worn jacket and the folder that had once held the blueprints. It was empty now, the papers handed over, the responsibility passed on. He started the engine and sat for a moment, letting the steady hum fill the silence. Then he drove toward the western road that wound along the cliffs. As he reached the bend overlooking the water, he stopped the truck and stepped out. The air was sharp and cool. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, its surface catching the fading gold of the sun. He stood there, listening to the rhythm of the waves. For a long time, he had thought that redemption meant undoing the past, but now he understood it differently. You couldn't unmake what was done. You could only face it, name it, and leave it behind in the open light. He closed his eyes and thought of the men he had lost, of the young engineer smiling in that old photograph, of the silence beneath the ground. He whispered a simple apology, carried away by the wind before it could echo back. Then he turned, climbed into the truck, and began to drive. The last light of the day caught the sealed hatch one final time, glinting briefly through the grass. Then the shadow of the bluff fell over it, and the metal disappeared into dusk. But above it, the rebuilt church stood steady against the sky, its bell faintly ringing in the wind, a sound that belonged not to morning, but to peace. And as Nolan's truck disappeared along the curve of the road, the sea continued its endless song, patient and eternal, washing over the rocks, as if it had always known that some things, once buried, must still find their way to the light. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are so many more stories to discover. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.